a statement was issued from the U.S. Embassy, to the U.S. Embassy from Bolivia, indicating they knew that the murderers, that the man's murderers were known, but they did not allow that to be reported to the U.S. media and so forth, so that they might protect the situation and not look bad in being involved with that Bolivian government.
Okay. Just a comment on that. I'm not familiar with that case in particular, but I think that that's fairly
Casimiro Huanca.
Oh, the Casimiro Huanca. I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name at the beginning. That's actually the individual I referred to earlier who was shot at close range and killed in December. That is fairly typical that news of what's going on in Bolivia does not make the U.S. press. It's not been an issue that's been on the front burner. And the U.S. Embassy is willing to accept the word of the Bolivian government regarding any deaths that occur at the hands of U.S.-funded forces. They do not conduct independent investigations, and they don't have an interest in cutting off funding until these cases have been resolved. They're sending the wrong message, and the climate of impunity in the coca-growing regions is going to continue as long as that's their attitude.
Yeah, my question to any one of you would be, now imagine there would be a definition of success. That is, let's say 50% of the coca leaf can be eradicated. Do you still think that under such a definition, the incredible damage that is done still merits the name of success? Is it still morally and internationally legitimate to continuously expose these countries to such a level of violence in order to reach some level of success in the eyes of the American army? This may be a rhetorical question.
I think so. Yeah, I think you know my answer. We cannot protect our kids by poisoning their kids. No. Simple as that.
Gina, is it possible to put up any of the slide of the upper Southern American continent again, or?
Not right now.
Okay, but people, you remember which slide I'm talking about. It shows all except the bottom part of Brazil that goes down next to Paraguay. And Brazil is 15% larger than the continental United States. And the part that you're not showing on your map was that 15%. So the part of Brazil on your map was roughly equivalent to the United States. Colombia, which on that map, is about 1.8 times as big as Texas. The U.S. Department of Agriculture estimated about in 1988 that South America it is agriculturally feasible using primitive farming methods for South America to produce 2,500 times as much cocaine as they do. Mm-hmm. And your graph that you showed of the production totals, it peaked in 95, but basically the total production has probably fluctuated 15%. Mm-hmm. And, I guess I just wanted to make that comment that I've heard that, you know, we can get rid of 20, we've successfully reduced it 15%, but they could make 2,500 times as much as they do now. It's just kind of silly.
I think we'd both concur.
All right, you will have opportunity later in the afternoon to ask further questions of these and other participants for the day. So thank you very much. It's my great pleasure now to introduce to you the Mayor of Houston and the former Director of the U.S. Office of National Drug Control Policy, and a good friend of mine, the Honorable Lee P. Brown. As many of you know, Mayor Brown holds a BA and MA and PhD in criminology from Berkeley, and he served as police chief or commissioner for Atlanta, Houston, and New York City before being named director of the ONDCP, and then moving further up to become a member of the sociology department at Rice, and a fellow at the Baker Institute. before being elected 3 times as mayor of the 4th largest city in America. I had the pleasure of co-teaching a criminology class with Professor Brown. I was impressed not only by his efficiency and expertise, but also by his humanity and humility. He came to us straight out of the White House, and at departmental meetings, I sometimes suspected that he felt decisions could have been reached more efficiently than they were, but he bore the academic decision-making process with great grace. I remember one incident stuck out in my mind. We have a house near Wembley, and I was on one weekend, we had to get a test ready, and I was talking to him about it, and he says, "Oh, I'll go copy it on Sunday afternoon. I'll go take the test for it." I thought, that's pretty good. He's a good man, a good friend, and I'm pleased he could be with us today. Mayor Brown.
Good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me to be with you today. And Bill, thank you for your very kind introduction. This is really a treat for me. If you come into the Rice campus within the hedges, it's very peaceful. My days are not often very peaceful at City Hall, so I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm pleased to be here because of Bill Martin invited me. At least I had the honor of co-teaching a class with him, and that was really a learning experience, not just for the students, but for me also. I think he has the distinction of being the best teacher on this campus. They'd have a contest every year, who's the #1 teacher. He'd win every year. I think you're emeritus right now. Give someone else a chance. So thank you for inviting me. It's good to be here with them. Ambassador DeRidgen, also the great director of this great institute. I had the distinction of being the first senior scholar here, so it's like coming home to me. I'm happy that you've invited me. For those of you who are not from Houston, let me welcome you to our city. We're very proud of Houston. We think it's one of the great cities in the world. And Main Street's just over there. If you go there, I'm reminded of Bob Hope, a great comedian. When he'd come to our city, he would say that this reminded him very much of Paris. In fact, there's a fountain, the Mecum Fountain. He would look out of the hotel room and see the fountain at night with the lights, and he said it was the most beautiful spot any place he's seen, and he'd travel all over the world. So we welcome you to our city. We're very, very glad that you're here. We'd like also for you to visit other parts of our city. Our downtown area is now a place where people go and have a good time. And so there's a lot to see in our city. We're very pleased that you're here. I've been asked to talk about the subject matter that brings us here today, that is the war on drugs, but from a perspective of cities. So that's what I want to do, talk about what we're doing here in Houston to address the problem of drugs. Keeping in mind that I have spent a considerable amount of my career in law enforcement. In fact, my first assignment as a young cop in San Jose, California, was to work undercover narcotics. And since that time, as you've heard, I've been in charge of police departments, the sheriff department in Portland, Oregon, Atlanta, Georgia, Houston, Texas, New York, and in addition to that, served as the drug policy director as a member of President Clinton's cabinet. So I have a little familiarity about the subject that brings us here today. You've had some excellent presentations already. I will attempt not to duplicate what you've already heard, but talk about what can a local jurisdiction do to address the problem of drugs. Let me first of all say that I've never used the metaphor war on drugs. I think it's the wrong metaphor for a number of reasons. First of all, I don't think our country should go to war against its people. Secondly, I believe that when you have a war, there's a tendency to declare victory and go home. We've done that on more than one occasion here in this country. So the metaphor of war on drugs is one that I tried to get this country to do away with when I served in Washington, D.C., obviously unsuccessfully. When I was the police chief here, drugs was a major problem at that time, as drugs are a major problem right now. We attempted to address the problem on the local level by creating what we call Houston Crackdown. And we created this back in 1988, and the purpose of Houston Crackdown was to bring together all of the entities that were involved, or at least should be involved, in helping to deal with the drug problem. Thus, the criminal justice system, the medical profession, the educators. And Houston Crackdown exists today and has survived over a period of years because it still serves its purpose. Its major objective is to coordinate the many different activities involved in the drug issue, whether it's prevention, treatment, education, enforcement, for all of them to work together in a coordinated way to reduce drug use in our community. Houston Crackdown also administers grant programs to community groups. We also provide local support to those who want to apply for assistance, because many times you find that volunteer community groups do not have the expertise to prepare their proposals, so we serve in that capacity as well. In 1998, myself, along with our Harris County Judge, Robert Eccles, we hosted our first regional summit on substance abuse right here at the Baker Institute. And again, we had an excellent turnout because the subject matter is one of utmost importance, and it should be of utmost importance to everyone. And as a result of that, we achieved our goals. Our goals were to improve the communication among the network of substance abuse providers, to share concerns among the many stakeholders, parents, children, agencies, the clergy, business, educators, on, and establish, most importantly, a course of action for our community. Where do we go from here? As a result of that summit, we now have a regional drug policy board. It's called the Houston Harris County Regional Substance Abuse Advisory Council, and it serves as really the linchpin for reviewing, for assessing, and monitoring substance abuse policies, not just locally, but the federal, state level as well. And with the ultimate objective of developing policies for a comprehensive approach to address substance abuse at the local level. In retrospect, the 1998 summit, it really served our community well, not just Houston, but Harris County as well. Our community partnerships have been highly productive. People are working together where before that was not the case. It also serves to reduce the duplication of services. That's obviously is important when you have limited resources to address the problems that we have at hand. We also maintain relationships with national agencies and organizations that are involved in substance abuse. Houston was recently included in the newly redesigned DON program, the Drug Abuse Warning Network. Heretofore, even though we're the fourth largest city in America, we were left out of that, and I never could understand why. That's an effort, as you know, is to record vital information on drug use trends as reported to our emergency rooms and other facilities that would see someone who would have the drug problem. We've teamed up with members of our Texas Medical Center. It's not very far from here. We do have the honor of having the world's largest medical center here in Houston. So we've teamed up with members of our Texas Medical Center to take advantage of the research institutions that exist here and apply for federal funds to become a national substance abuse research center. And certainly Rice University would be a very important part of that initiative. If we are successful, it gives us the opportunity to monitor and study effective treatment modalities that may someday be available to all who suffer from addiction. Let me just mention some other initiatives that we have going on in our city. The Houston Crackdown Bright Ideas Community Grant Fund. We disperse about $1 million of funds to local schools, religious organizations, and youth-serving agencies in order to provide prevention curricula to assist in educating young people to the dangers of substance abuse. More than 200,000 youth have served in this program. I want to add that many of these children have also received treatment services from the Bright Idea funds. We have the Lee P. Brown's Religious Drug Forum. That program brought together about 300 area ministers We wanted to inform our ministers about available substance abuse services, but in truth, we accomplished much more than that. It went much beyond that. The Mayor's Ministerial Advisory Board now serves as an active participant in developing comprehensive strategies to address substance abuse in many ways, using the resources they have at their disposal, whether it's counseling or education. And they have turned out to be great partners in helping us to address this issue. In August of 1999, the City of Houston and the Office of National Drug Control Policy, then under the leadership of my friend General Barry McCaffrey, entered into agreement to collect and analyze and disseminate relevant substance abuse data. We think this is a potentially very valuable contribution to the government's forming a national strategy from the perspective of the local level where we see the problem. In February of 2001, demand treatment was initiated. We did this with a Robert Wood Johnson grant and joined together organization to increase awareness of assessment, treatment, and intervention services. My office has hosted and co-hosted a number of forums to help address the issue, particularly using young people. I have a youth city council that works with me very closely on this issue. There are many other things that we've done. The DARE program is still in existence here, where our police officers go into the classroom. But the overall objective is to prevent young people from using drugs to begin with, and when you find people that are on drugs, to provide a mechanism for getting them off. I believe that it has to be a community-wide effort. It has to start with the family. It has to carry over into the schools, kindergarten, all the way to the 12th grade. And in addition, our religious institutions, our community groups, all have a role to play to accomplish this objective. But it must start with the family. The family can play a great role in preventing drug use to begin with. I've raised 4 kids, and I know how difficult it is to raise kids myself, but I'm very pleased that they're all grown now, and now I have grandchildren to worry about. But when I was a police chief here, I knew clearly that just because I was a police chief, my children would not be immune from the influences out there in the broader community. And I remember many times I would go into my daughters, their twin daughters, go into their bedroom and search and see if I had a problem in my home. But I'd tell them what I was doing, and they didn't like it. They would tell me that, Daddy, you're violating my rights, rights of privacy. And my response was, as long as you live in my house, you have to follow my rules. Why did I do that? I think parents have an obligation, a duty, and a responsibility, first of all, to make sure that our homes are drug-free. And to do that, we have to do more than just talk. We have to also demonstrate that we are concerned by exhibiting what I call the tough love. I have drawn a conclusion that if we're going to break the cycle of drug use, that what we're going to have to do is to make sure that we provide prevention and education programs to our young people, and then at the same time provide treatment programs to those who are addicted to drugs. When I was in Washington, D.C., I knew that we had about 1 million people in America who could benefit from treatment that we were not serving. For whatever reason, those who allocate the funds to the drug effort in America seems to think that you're being soft on crime if you put money into prevention programs and treatment. We proposed to Congress a $559 million hardcore drug use treatment program and got about $50 million. It's easier to get money for interdiction, DEA, FBI, much more difficult to get money to deal with treatment programs or prevention programs. After having a number of years' experience in dealing with the issue of criminal justice in America, with the problems of drugs particularly, it's quite clear to me that the answer has to be in prevention and education and treatment. You had an excellent presentation about Colombia. I've been to Colombia many times, Peru, Bolivia, Brazil, all over the drug-producing countries, any place in the world. And I can tell you, we're not going to stop the production of drugs. And even if we were able to stop it, say we were able to build a wall around America and no drugs would come in, guarantee you, with the ingenuity we have here, synthetic drugs would be a substitute for everything that we kept out. There's no, just take the border of Mexico. I don't know the figures right now, but at one point, most of the drugs were coming from Colombia into Mexico, but the Mexican cartels started trying to cut out the middleman, so they were growing drugs, growing the coca leaf as well. If we have a 2,000-mile coastline with the country, you're not going to keep the drugs out. And that's why I reached the conclusion that if we're serious about dealing with drugs, what we have to do is do everything we can to make sure that our children have a clear understanding that they shouldn't use drugs. Those who are addicted to drugs are provided treatment, because I know no other way to get an addict off of drugs than through treatment. I don't know any other way. And it's not a problem, as we often tend to think it is, of the inner city being used to talk about poor people or minority people. I remember when I was in Washington, I was asked to go out to Potomac, Maryland, to talk to a class, a high school, and it was a religious school, because the reporter who asked me, his daughter was using drugs. I went there, and all the parents came, and this was, if you know Potomac, Maryland, it's a very, very high economic part of our country. I spoke to all the parents and the students in an auditorium, and after the presentation, the parents left, and I spoke just to the students. I asked the question, how many of you know of anyone in this school who uses drugs? With every hand went up. As they asked me questions, they would start off by saying, I am, in their name, I am an alcoholic, or I am a recovering drug user. So it's not a problem just for low-income people. This is an American problem. I have not seen any segment of our society escape what we're going through as far as the drugs concerned. I believe that the greatest threat to the national security of America really is the drug problem. Also consider the fact that the majority of the people who use drugs also go to work every day. They hold down a job. Drugs in the workplace is a serious problem, and if we want to deal with drugs, we have to also deal with drugs in the workplace. I wish I could come here today and tell you there was an easy solution to this problem. There is no easy solution. There is no silver bullet that will take this problem away from us. But if I concluded my remarks by just sharing with you all the things I've experienced in the course of my career, the answer is very simple. We have to, number one, keep people from using drugs. Number two, provide treatment to get those who are on drugs off of drugs. So again, let me thank you for inviting me to be here with you today, and if time permits, I'll be glad to take any questions that anyone may have. Okay.
Mayor Brown, I can recall when you were director of ONDCP and that you mentioned that we could never arrest our way out of this problem. I recall your requests for increases in the budget for treatment. Yesterday we were treated to Director Hutchison expressing his belief that we had to increase that. In your day, roughly 2/3 of our federal budget went to interdiction and not into the treatment, prevention, and education you've talked about. Today, those numbers are unchanged, although the people in a series of related offices have expressed their desire to make that shift. Nothing has in fact occurred. Can you just reflect a moment on the resistance and how we might begin to overcome that resistance?
It's all tied up into politics. Those who are making the decisions on the appropriation of resources, as I saw it, and I suspect it hasn't changed yet, do not want to be seen back home as being soft on drugs. And therefore, they make decisions that are very uninformed. I started to try to address that while I was back there, and what I started to do was to take some of the the Congress people to drug treatment centers. You'd be surprised, many have never been to a drug treatment facility, or take them to a prevention program. And if you would kind of convert them, because I believe if you go to a place where people are being treated and listen to those who are the addicts and find out what benefit the treatment is to them, then you'll understand why treatment works. Or go to a good prevention program and talk to some of the kids, you'll understand why that's important. So the quick answer to your question is, I think it's all tied up into politics. It's easy to vote for money for interdiction, and interdiction has not worked. And we had boats out there on the sea. It's kind of like trying to find a pebble out on the beach with all the vast amount of water. How are you going to find one ship that might very well be carrying drugs? That's not the answer. The answer has to be, as I said on more than one occasion, prevention, education, and treatment. And the short answer to your question is I think it's tied to our elected officials being reluctant to vote money for education, prevention, and treatment, and seeing it as competing with the enforcement interdiction of funds, rather than setting a priority and understanding that treatment, prevention, education has to be the top priority.
My name is Howard Wooldridge. I'm from Fort Worth, retired police officer. You and I both know the great futility of trying to incarcerate our way out of this problem. Would you use your office as mayor of Houston to direct the police department to essentially not spend the time to bust people for personal amounts of the drugs, much as the police in Europe are now not busting people for personal amounts of drugs? As the three-time mayor of the city, you may have some political cover where you can do this sort of make this move, make this change, without perhaps being committing political suicide.
Well, saying that you're a former police officer, you know as well as I do that the police officers have the responsibility of enforcing laws that are enacted by the legislature. So unless the laws are changed, the police are responsible for doing so. Some people don't like to get traffic tickets, but the police officers are charged with that responsibility of writing traffic tickets. As long as we have laws, the police, and I hope it never changes, do not have the luxury of choosing what laws they want to enforce. That would be contrary to our system of government and the separation of the powers in America. And so I just don't see that happening.
I think you're, Mr. Mayor, I'm from Houston. My name's Clayton Jones. I am different than a lot of other people here. My interest is in medical marijuana. I have stopped using 11 medications that they were prescribed for me. Now, if I try to be a healthy person, I am subject to your laws. I don't want to lose my home. I don't want to lose everything I've worked for. What can you do for people like us?
Again, that's a legislative issue. I think I had to deal with that issue when I was in Washington, and my position then is the same as it is right now. When the medical profession determines that that's the right use of marijuana for medical purposes, that's when we should change policy. And until they come up with that conclusion through research, then it won't change.
Mr. Mayor, they have come up with that conclusion way back, as far back as President Nixon. Long before then, it's been in herbal medicine that's been used 170 years before Christ. That's been written and recorded. And you still sit there and you tell me that I'm wrong for trying to be a healthy person.
When I was responsible for this nation's drug control policy, the information I received from the medical profession was contrary to what you're telling me right now. I don't know if it's changed or not, but it's contrary to what you're telling me right now.
Well, I'm not interested in the whole country. I'm interested in Houston, where I live. This is my home. This is where I want to stay. I don't want to be chased out because of people's...
Well, unfortunately, Houston does not have the authority to change the laws that are state or federal laws. We don't have the authority to do that locally.
You have the authority to tell people to look the other way, because they can do that on a traffic ticket. They can do that in a domestic disturbance.
No,
You
I
can
think
give
you're
them the
wrong there.
authority
We
that they
don't-
have it everywhere else.
I don't
to
want
do
to
it in
argue
there.
with you, but we don't tell the police officers to look the other way. Just to the contrary, we tell the police officers it's their obligation and duty and responsibility to enforce the law.
Mayor Brown, my name is Dick Evans. First of all, thank you very much for coming. We appreciate your being here. I'm a physician, and I'd like to ask a question about needle exchange programs. I think you're aware that that AIDS is decimating our community, particularly the African American community, and you know, and we have learned this morning that needle exchange programs are very effective in other parts of the world. Though I don't know this for sure, I think it may be true that Houston may be the only large metropolitan city that does not have a needle exchange program. And of course, in Texas, most of those are being done with a wink and a nod agreement between the DA and the chief of police in those cities. And so I understand your previous response to other questions regarding upholding the law, but I'd like to hear any other comments you may have on that.
I also have looked at the whole issue of the needle exchange programs, and the policy that we had at the federal level was that if it reduces the use of drugs and doesn't increase the use of drugs, there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, you can use federal monies for the needle exchange programs if the Surgeon General will make that determination that it will not increase drug use and help reduce the drug use.
Well, that has been proven, of course, not only in this country but elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
We're going to return now to an issue that we were talking about earlier, and that is the relationship between the war on drugs, U.S. policy, and terrorism. You met Dr. Ernie Drucker yesterday in his presentation on public health. Today he's talking about public health again, but on a different at a different level. We've mentioned, it's been mentioned several times here, the television commercials linking terrorism with drugs. And also we've talked about linking terrorism with the war on drugs. And this is the topic Dr. Drucker will address in his presentation, which he titles Fearful Symmetry, Terrorism and the Drug Wars.
When I hit that, it'll turn it on.
It's already up.
Oh, I don't want it up. Heck, thanks for the opportunity to speak a bit out of the area of my expertise, and my qualifications around this are not in any way related to my qualifications as a public health professional. But by way of stating some of those qualifications, and maybe also as a kind of a disclosure, I do have an interest in the question of terrorism and what it means now and what we can do about it and how it relates to the issue I've devoted 30 years of my life to, which is drugs. First of all, I'm a Jewish American from New York City, and we've been struck in New York City in a way that's been very painful to us. I'm a father. My son works across the street from the World Trade Center. He was 15 minutes late for work that day, so was spared the worst impact of being in the midst of the attack, although friends of his were not, including a colleague who was murdered in Pakistan, a journalist, Daniel Pearl. So I take all this very, very personally, actually, and I've decided that's okay. as a way of looking at something so vast. I think that it's maybe seem an odd time to talk about ending drug prohibition and legalizing drugs. But I think actually it couldn't be a better moment for opening that discussion. I say this because for all its other meanings, September 11th represents the end of what for many Americans was a long period of denial and ignorance and public tolerance of ineffective government. And there's a few areas where we are so ineffective as in the war on drugs. September 11th, for many Americans, marks the end of a certain kind of innocence about what's happening in the world and our place in it. And I think that's a good thing, actually. Those of us who travel around the world, and we saw it in the previous presentations from Latin America and the other presentations from Europe, may see a little more than the average American sees of the kind of suffering that goes on, the kind of dissatisfaction, the frustration, impossibility of change. The questions from my friend over there to the mayor about what are we going to do about this situation now. Multiply that a few billion times for the frustration and ineffectiveness of people being able to get any response to their very real needs from political apparatus. So I think it's a very good time to bring this up. We know that from previous discussions, and we've all thought about this, without talking about cause and effect and which came first, that there are a lot of symmetries between the situation in which it's possible to exert enormous events of violence against all kinds of people in the world, September 11th just being our most personal and most recent episode. There are symmetries of people, the criminal networks, the international criminal networks that are built around the world at this point to deal with drugs, materiel, crossing borders, contraband, the massive amount of movement of those materials, the money, the number of transactions, the trillions of dollars every day moving through the banking system, the money laundering, that's a part of that. The corruption of government and law enforcement at the service of all sorts of illicit trades, not just the drug trade, weapons, prostitution, human contraband. The culture of violence that's been generated around, certainly around the drug wars. And most fundamentally, the undermining of civil society and the rule of law, as we see laws that mean nothing to many of the people who are in a position to act against them, and yet cannot protect ourselves from some of the worst consequences of those failures. But at the end of the day, I am an epidemiologist, I'm a numbers guy, and I've tended to look at this and tried to look at this, and this is kind of a work in progress, and I really welcome your criticism, in terms of what the numbers look like and what they say about the symmetries between terrorism, by which I really mean non-state violence practiced against people living within sovereign countries, and the relation to the drug trade, the drug markets that we've been talking about here for 2 days. Did I get this right? Yes. What I've done here is to try to do some comparison of the size of illicit drug markets and other global commodity markets. And I owe a debt of thanks here to Ambassador Richard Butler, who I've begun to work with on this at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City. On the left, yes, the left, is the illicit drug trade, an estimate, and these are dollar volumes. Illicit drug trade estimated to be $400 to $500 billion a year by Interpol and by the UNDCP. And hard to verify a number like that. But we know the trade in the United States is $100 billion approximately. Even Canada, I saw, was $10 billion. Europe's probably a similar amount, and the rest of the world, double that. So it's not in the wrong order of magnitude. In these kinds of comparisons, the important thing is it trillions, billions, millions, tens of millions. That's the right way to look at it for now, because you can't get more precise, and the numbers are changing all the time. But take the illicit drug trade at $500 billion a year. By comparison, cigarette sales globally are up to about $120 billion a year. I'm told alcohol is a similar kind of number. So already, the illicit drug trade is about 4 or 5 times the size of cigarettes. Motor vehicle production, just to give you a sense of scale, about 50,000 motor vehicle year. I'm trying to remember the scale from the thing. Yeah, it might be 50 million vehicles produced a year. I remember to see the number, 50 million. And the trade's a little over $1 trillion, about $1.1 trillion, 1,100 billion. Crude petroleum, at the price of $25 a barrel, which it is now, comes out to about the same as the drug trade, $500 billion a year. Defense expenditures worldwide, of which the United States is almost half, is $805 billion. And the weapons trade, international trade in weapons, is $30 billion. Now, the reason I give these numbers is as a starting point for looking at whether the international drug trade qualifies as a strategic commodity in the same way that the weapons trade clearly does and petroleum clearly does. Because one of the questions a lot of people have asked is, given its magnitude and significance relative to other global commodities, how come it doesn't receive the same attention as a global commodity, as opposed to the moral construction that we waste most of our time on? And I think the presentations this afternoon about South America are very dramatic illustrations of what this means to the fate of nations around the world, what the failure to deal with this strategically in a way that relates to our interests of self-protection at this point in time. Is this right? No? There we go. What I've tried to do is take these global markets and look at them in terms of the number of customers, number of users that are involved, and the annual dollar amount per user, just again to get a rough sense of scale. And it's quite revealing, actually, using the drug figure. And what I've done is guesstimated the number of users at 250 million worldwide, which is a bigger number, I think, than is warranted, but I wanted to be conservative in this because, you know, we know that in the United States there are about 30 or 40 million users of illicit drugs, probably a similar number in Europe. And those Europe and the United States represent about less than 1/6 of the population of the world, only about 10% of the population of the world. So I've added the rest on and said roughly 250 million people might be involved in the illicit drug trade. And that includes people buying khat in Somalia and people buying homegrown cannabis in Kenya, but it also involves the truly international trade, which is spreading out very rapidly. Alex Wodak mentioned earlier about the number of countries involved in the international drug trade now, and it's almost the same as the UN membership, whereas 50 years ago, it was a much smaller number. There were a few producer nations, there were a few consuming groups, and a few European and North American nations, and that was about it. And that's quite different. I just finished reviewing a set of papers from Kenya in Africa, looking at the growth of injecting heroin use and development of heroin markets in Nairobi and Mombasa in Kenya, with all the ominous implications of that given their HIV epidemic that's already in place. And the growth of injecting drug use, we already know, is driving the AIDS epidemic in China and in Asia. So very, very significant that the number of users is growing, and the number of users of the most dangerous forms of the transnational drug market are growing. But those numbers come out to about 2,000 per year per user. By contrast, and it's really the numbers aren't as important as the scale, that the oil, and I take for that the base of the customer base of that being about 2.5 billion people, the people who were mentioned before having $1 a year income or less, those 2 billion people, probably out of the petroleum market in some way, even though they're affected by petroleum. The agriculture that grows the food that they eat is based on petroleum. I was interested to learn from an article in the Sunday Times Magazine a few weeks ago about beef production, that about 3 pounds of petroleum goes into the production of every pound of beef in the United States. So the petroleum market's pretty well saturated into the world, and I've taken a number of 2.5 billion customers, about a little less than a third of the world population. And that comes out to $216 per year per person. Defense budgets, that 800 billion figure, spread again about you could say the whole population of the world is implicated in defense, but that's not really true. A lot of the population of the developing nations is outside the umbrella of those defense apparatus, has little to do with it. And here in the United States, for example, with a $300 to $400 billion budget for 280 million people, the amount per person is obviously much more. But that number comes out in the hundreds also. And finally, cigarettes also comes out in the low hundreds per user, about 1 billion users of cigarettes in the world, now projected to go to 1.6 billion. In addition to these comparisons, there are differences in the market share that these markets have now. So there's an oil supply in the world, and there are countries trying to get as much of it to develop. There are fights about who can use it and who can burn it and what it does to the environment. But the dynamics of that market are in a way predictable. Probably likewise defense. Not so for drugs and not so for cigarettes. if it's true that 250 million people are in the world now, are using the drug market in the world now, there's nothing but room for growth in that market. It doesn't mean that everybody in the world wants to use drugs, but it does mean that there's plenty of room to expand that market. And the cigarette people have gotten a good handle on that. They've recognized, for example, that the women throughout the developing world are underrepresented in the smoking population. They've gone after them vigorously. The drug dealers who are selling drugs now in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and Central Europe have created markets that were not there before. There was not intravenous drug use in Eastern Germany in 1985. And there is intravenous drug use in Eastern Germany and in Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria and the Ukraine and the Soviet Union now. And it's already implicated in massive AIDS epidemics, and there's plenty of room for growth. And that's the frightening part of this picture, that if these relationships are valid, these markets are, as we say, this one for the drug market, 500 billion, is at the early stage of development. And we've heard, I think, very, very eloquent descriptions of how our policies could not be better designed but to grow that market. Now, if that market and its relationships to the porousness of borders, the corruptibility of public officials, the loss of respect for law and order, the culture of violence, the money transactions, if that market is most of what moves around from country to country, the largest estimate of the budget of Osama bin Laden I ever saw was $150 million. That is a minuscule amount of money to ride in this stream. Think of it as bandwidth. Think of the drug trade and its compromise of borders and its number of people involved, both as customers and as sellers and as agents of all sorts. The numbers involved there are so massive compared to all the things that we're concerned with in terrorism, even large compared to the international weapons trade, the legitimate international weapons trade, that you could not create a bigger, better pipeline for concealing anything that you want to conceal. There was a piece in USA Today, which they left in our hotel, about the latest stories of smugglers' refined tricks for passing stricter security. And it's funny because these articles always have the same sense of surprise that they discovered that these guys are greedy and clever, and that they can strap things to the bottom of cruise ships when they make it impossible to get through the airports. We used to joke that the easiest way to smuggle a nuclear weapon into the United States was to hide it in a barrel of cocaine. And it seems that that's what these guys are doing now. That the ability to breach the borders is so great because the commerce is so great. There are 1 million containers a year that come into New York City. The most advanced technology of X-raying these containers and the most generous deployment of personnel enables us to inspect about 1% of them. And there are discussions now of using technology to enhance that, but the movement of commerce, the globalization that's happening in the world, absolutely goes against the grain of trying to slow things down, to look at them. We see this in the airports. We see the impact this has on our movements. So all the trends of commerce in the world work in the opposite direction from trying to keep out something as ubiquitous and as driven by profit motives as illicit drugs. And as we pose ourselves the problem of what to do about drugs and continue to adhere to this only sort of one-minded solution, I don't consider treatment of people who become addicted to drugs a solution to the drug problem. That's rather late in the day. It's like having better and better treatment for cancer caused by air pollution, water pollution, and cigarette smoking. You might want to do something to prevent them because we're never going to be that great at treating them. And I think we're good at treating some aspects of drug abuse, and we certainly should do that when we can. It's unconscionable not to. We've heard from Dr. Wodak from Australia and others about how effective this can be in preventing AIDS and how effective it can be in treating heroin addiction. We can treat heroin addiction better than we can treat cancer at this point, and yet we're not allowed to, for the reasons that we're preoccupied with the war on drugs. But the message I want to leave you with, that as long as we insist on a prohibition structure that absolutely assures the value of these drugs, we will have these huge channels for the movement of contraband, of money, of people, of violence, in which it's very easy to fit those small increments that we call terrorism. Thank you.
Take some questions here.
Sure.
There are questions for Dr. Drucker?
Maybe you want to bring back the other people also.
Yes, we're going to bring back others very soon. But, you're coming for a question, right? Okay.
Ernie, you talked about undermining civil society, and there's an aspect to the drug terror connection, and specifically the advertising campaign, that troubles me, and I was wondering if you comment on it. Congress, in its infinite wisdom, forbids the Voice of America from broadcasting domestically. It didn't want any particular party, no matter who was in power, to have the ability to use taxpayer money to influence the opinions of the very people who put them into office. And yet, the drug terror ads are a highly partisan, very narrow, selective interpretation of a very complex social phenomenon, right? By definition, I think you could call it legitimately propaganda. Mm-hmm. And here we have ONDCP using taxpayer money as a government agency to propagandize against the very citizens who put them into office. And I think that's an aspect of this whole ad campaign that's been largely ignored. And I think it's a fatal line that we're crossing. Do we want people like Paul Wolfowitz in Department of Defense, the Uber hawk, who wants to go to war with Iraq? Do we want to give him a budget to run ads whipping the American public into hysteria to have a war with Iraq? Is that a legitimate use of taxpayer funds?
What it strikes me at is incredibly exploitative for beating the drum about a failed policy, the war on drugs, at the expense of the supposed agenda of those ads for kids, which is to tell them they shouldn't use drugs. And I think the best evidence of that has been the reaction of kids to those ads. I mean, the fact that they're placed in the Times and the Wall Street Journal suggests that they're not meant for kids. They're meant for the adult population who are constantly looking to the government to say, what are you doing about this problem? So they say, here, we're doing these things. And the confusion between gestures made which are supposed to enhance security, for example, but are actually for public consumption, rather than actually, it's similar to that. So a lot of what we go through in the airports now hasn't much to do with actual security. It has to do with the appearance of security. And these ads have to do with the appearance of trying to do something about drugs. But they're very cynical, and they're very exploitative. And I think and such things always backfire, have the reverse effect, make kids more cynical about the messages.
Could you comment on this circular problem? Our mayor attributed the his inaction on some things, and other people have alluded to it, to legislators and their willingness to duck for cover by simply going ahead with the war on drugs so that they look good at home. Now, if the views of the people in this room represent at home, then that argument doesn't make a lot of sense.
You notice that?
Well, the question is that if they're doing that for somebody, there must be someone for whom they're doing it. Mm-hmm. And who might that be?
Well, these people in this room do not represent a random cross-section of the populace of Houston, to be sure. And I think the constituency that thinks that we have to be harder and do more of the war on drugs is real. I think a lot of that is driven by an absolutely legitimate concern about the effects of an ineffectual campaign about drugs in our communities on their children. You look a parent in the eye who lives in a community in which 3 kids have died of overdoses in the last 6 months. They're really alarmed about what's going to be done about drugs, and a completely legitimate alarm. And in the absence of effective measures, I think that kind of propaganda and that kind of attempt to give the illusion of action is quite predictable. That's what people do who want to stay in office very often. The problem is we do have alternatives. We actually do have alternatives about treatment. We have alternatives about prevention. We have alternatives about public policy. And what's so noteworthy about this event is that it's one of the few occasions in a significant institution of public policy in this country where there has been an open discussion of those alternatives. But I notice it's a discussion of those alternatives, an exposition mostly. It is not a debate. It's not a dialogue, because that other part of the community isn't here for various reasons. So I think it's a good beginning to get to state the case, and I would hope there'll be a follow-up that will bring the other part of this in, and we can get down to arguing about it. Because what I meant in my remarks about September 11th and the change in consciousness is I do think that actually, more than before September 11th, Americans understand the meaning of danger and risk and threat. It can go in the wrong direction. It can be used to justify repression and loss of privacy. And I don't know, I can't predict it. We're very early in this game, obviously. But I do think there's an openness at this moment, and there's the ability to differentiate between the dangers of guys flying airplanes into your buildings because they hate you, and the dangers of your teenage son using a drug that you'd rather he not use, but you understand that maybe it's a stage he has to get through. There's a different order of magnitude, risks and threats, and to apply the same rhetoric and the same models and the full force of government attention to the one and be rather ineffectual about the other. I mean, about the terrorist attacks, despite all the activity, many of us have the feeling of a shocking loss of confidence in the ability of our government to protect us. The vulnerability that those attacks demonstrated, and when they mailed the visas to the guys who did it 6 months later, I mean, that the system is so ineffective that we thought was looking out for us. There's some catching up to do on the part of government at this point to try to reestablish confidence on the part of the American people. And I think a lot of the first attempts to do that have more to do with the appearances than they do with reality. But I have a feeling reality asserts itself in this world, just as it did on September 11th, and I think it will again. And as that goes along, I think there'll be more of a discrimination about what matters and what doesn't. I don't know if that answers your question.
Ernie, I guess just following up, this is more of a comment than a question, but of course the other side of the drugs funding terrorism equation is that for a long time drugs have been used as a tool to support ideologically aligned groups. And we know French intelligence in the first Indochina War were funding their activities.
CIA.
The CIA in the hill tribes of Thailand was shipping drugs out. The Mujahideen in Afghanistan, of course, were getting some of their financing from the drug trade. The Northern Alliance now, I just read in the last week that U.S. government officials are saying, well, look, we know they're trafficking stuff, but we want them on our side. So that's the other part of the equation. It's not only the bad guys profiting from drug prohibition, it's the good guys. And we have to, I'm not quite sure how this... Well, yeah, there may not be any good guys, but the guys that the U.S. government considers to be the good guys or whatever. So we have to factor this into the analysis too, and I'm not quite sure how that's going to come out. But that's also one of the factors at play. And it may be, a cynic might argue that governments are happy to have the drug trade in one sense because it gives them another vehicle for financing organizations outside the normal financing programs of government.
I mean, there are parts of government, I suppose, that do that inevitably. And in fact, I've had friends explain to me how could we let our security apparatus deteriorate so badly? The French, have every group infiltrated. The French secret police and the French equivalent to the CIA, pay attention very closely to us, especially since they were hit in attacks in Paris over the last 10 years. And that's probably what will happen here. It's one of the recommendations, is that the enhancement of covert activities to know better what's going on and have a handle on it. In this world, countries need to do that to protect themselves. But the war on drugs compromises that because it creates these huge holes in the wall through which people and money and stuff is moving all the time, inexorably driven by those kinds of profit margins that Sanho talked about. There's nothing that it's globalization. Nothing can resist those kinds of profit margins that we know about. It's a tremendous confirmation of capitalist principles in action. Okay, thank you all very much.
If you'll hang on for just a few moments here, or you may stand up and stretch, we're going to put the chairs up for if you have other questions of people who spoke today. And we want certainly not to leave before hearing Ethan Nadelman talk to us at the end of the discussion period. But yesterday, those of you who were not here should know that the discussion period was a lively and very fruitful time of exchange, and want to encourage you to stay for that.
Check, check. 1, 2. One, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2, 2.
Take one to one.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2. 1, 2.
Want this one?
1, 2, 3. 1, 2. 1, 2. 2, 2, 2, 2. 1, 2, 2, 2.
Needs to go up a little bit. Okay. Okay. We're just about ready, I think. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. Okay.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. See, that's too loud. 1, 2. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. 1, 2. Microphone check.
All right, would the participants for the speakers for today come on up to Peter and Dr. Van der Linde? Aren't able to come back up here? Just have the days, and if there are other questions for any of the yes.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I think we're doing
We'll either go out.
That's how I first got cancer back in '95. I got my cancer. We met a cancer.
No, I want you to have a chance to ask a question.
Where's the guy?
Dr. Martin. She's got one. Dr. Martin has the other.
All right, I think we're about ready to reassemble here. We have our panel for today here assembled, and also Kevin for yesterday. But if you have questions that you would like to ask of anyone who spoke yesterday, and that's a fair game too. This is kind of a wind-up panel, and if we can pass the microphone to them. I'd like to say if you have questions for Dr. Van der Linde or for Eugene Oscapella, I'd like to give precedence to the people who might have questions for them, because they didn't. We took took off their time, or we wound up at a little tight there this morning and said we'd put it off, so we give you first crack at them. Also, I forgot to mention this morning, I want to thank the Consul General of the Swiss Consulate, Mr. Armand Maley, who was very helpful in obtaining and getting Dr. Van der Linde to be here, and we're happy that he is able to. So,
all right, I will take first crack then. Eugene Oscapella, will you tell us what the status is, please, of the hemp industry movement in Canada? How are you doing? Are we in the United States of America reaching our NAFTA agreements with you by keeping your products out of our country? What are your views?
Well, basically, hemp is largely a non-issue in Canada. We started growing it several years ago and producing hemp products, and it sort of disappeared into the background of drug policy issues in Canada until I guess it was the DEA that decided that any hemp product or any hemp food was going to be considered a controlled substance or whatever. It was going to be criminalized, and it may violate our free trade agreement with NAFTA. And there's some suggestion that Canada will challenge that. Now I understand that the ruling has been put in, or the DEA position has been put on hold temporarily. But in the long run, yeah, maybe along with softwood lumber and our hemp industry, we may not have anything left to sell to the States. So that's where that's where it seems to be going right now. But it's not on the radar screen normally in Canada. It's just the stuff is grown and people are growing it, and it has to be below a certain level of THC content.
Barry?
This is for Dr. Wodak. In this morning's presentation, you mentioned that the AIDS prevention programs in Australia, the government invested about 10 million Australian dollars and calculated that they saved about 290 million Australian dollars, which gives a 29-to-1 return on investment. In the United States, if we do 2-to-1 return for public programs, public health programs, is considered a smashing success. Is that, well, did I hear that right? Did I see your graphic right?
It was actually 270 million, not 290 million.
Okay, thank you. Only 27 to 1 was obviously not.
The estimate was made by Dr. Richard Feacham, who subsequently worked in the World Bank and is now based in San Francisco, and is a health economist, I believe originally from the United Kingdom.
Great. Well, thank you for that.
And he did that independent, he was commissioned to do an independent evaluation of the effectiveness of the whole AIDS program, and that was just part of his work.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, can we move on to other areas now?
Sure.
Is that okay? All right. I had a question for Dr. Tree about your statements on Colombia. I was wondering, you said that our current policy about fumigation and destroying the crops is not effective, and I wondered what you would suggest that we do instead of this. I mean, I know that's a pretty hard question, but just like the basics of what areas should we work? Should we try to put all our money to developing the agriculture? Should we try to get their state to provide more support for their citizens? What do you think about that?
You asked me what we ought to be doing, so that's pretty wide open. I'm going to take you at your invitation. I think we ought to move to a regulated distribution model for these substances. That's the only sustainable solution that I see. Short of providing some other crop that's going to provide that kind of profit margin for these people, I just don't see how you can control the ecological destruction caused by the processing of coca, the gasoline and sulfuric acid that's dumped into the rivers, and then followed by the fumigation. So we're twice cursing this land. And I think we need to have this discussion about different ways to regulate drugs. We have a gift in this country for regulation. When I debate drug warriors, which is rarely they want to debate, but when they do, they throw out this red herring. Well, if you don't support our existing policy, then you're for selling heroin and candy machines to kids. And I think that gets to the heart of the poverty of our political discourse. That is to say that the Inuit, the Eskimo, have more than 24 words to describe snow. Snow is important to them. We have 2 words to describe politics, Democrat or Republican. And if you vote green, you're just way off the charts. But every human society has found a different way to organize themselves, to regulate things. There's a whole spectrum of possibilities. And that carries over in the way we talk about drugs. And you know, we have ways of regulating everything in a society. We regulate what frequencies my cell phone can operate on, how much power can come of a wall socket. We regulate, I can't sell you a hot dog in the street without getting a license, a health inspection. The hot dog that I buy has to come from a factory that's been certified by an inspector who went to an accredited university. All of this up and down the line just to make sure I'm not going to sell you anything except 100% ground up animal parts in that hot dog. And yet when it comes to something as dangerous or as potentially destructive as illicit drugs, we choose not to regulate at all. And there are many ways we can regulate these things.
I'd like to comment on that. I've told you this morning the position of the Swiss government and parliament as a chairman of this Federal Commission on drug issues. We are one step ahead in the discussion in this commission, and I think what we heard before is exactly what we discuss in this commission. I think we should have, for all drugs, a kind of regulated market, as we heard before. But that's politically speaking, I can say this because I'm not part of the federal government or its administration, but I think that's the only way to get one step further, that we can control this with good regulations.
I think that the issues of regulation of the production and distribution of these drugs are different than the issues of the regulation of their use by the consumers. And I think and a lot of Peter Cohn's data they presented make quite clear that self-regulatory and community regulatory models actually are the norm. And they come into place when you remove these other forces that deform the ability to regulate use. So our use of alcohol is a good example of that there are community norms and social norms. Someone said at lunch today, you know, I have a drink of wine in the afternoon after work, but I don't have a drink of wine with breakfast. And that's culture, and drugs are part of culture, and the norm around the world is for cultures to actually develop ways of dealing with drugs that are actually pretty effective for the goals of that culture and result in a minimum of harmful and abusive uses of the drug. And people who do that are seen as deviant, and they're treated that way in most societies. But they usually represent a minority of users of the drug. And that includes intoxication. There are all sorts of events in societies that are associated with getting intoxicated, but they're time limited and they're socially limited. And I think we have to have more faith and actually be more supportive of the normal cultural mechanisms for controlling personal behavior and social behavior, and that as we impose these other regulatory mechanisms, they undermine the ability to do those other more natural ways which lead in the right direction, I believe.
Can we get another microphone? I didn't realize. That'll be enough.
Yeah.
No, I'd like to emphasize what Ernie is saying. Our institute did research into patterns of cocaine use from 85 to 91, and later we did follow-up research. And we find all the time that most experienced users living in Amsterdam and not recruited from treatment programs or prisons, but from the general population, and we did research with hundreds of them. They have all kinds of regulatory mechanisms by which they protect all the other aspects of their life. They're not drinking alcohol all day and all evening. They're not snorting cocaine all day or all evening. They have work to do, they have kids, they have cars to drive, they have theater performances to see. So what they do is they develop mechanisms quite naturally, but also looking at their peers, how they do it, to integrate cocaine use into a everyday, quite rich lifestyle. Now, if you associate cocaine use with the patterns that you see in highly deprivileged and highly poor and undeveloped parts of city ghettos, then you can see something completely different. Then you see images of cocaine use that look like the images of alcohol use during the days of industrialization in Europe. When you have so much poverty and so much lack of social development in your own country, people will start to use drugs to depress misery. But most people in our rich societies use alcohol and drugs to amplify pleasure. And to amplify pleasure, that means that you do not destroy pleasure. So the regulatory mechanisms of drug use are, for most people, shaped in such a way that they are not self-destructing. So most drug use and most alcohol use that we see around us in, let's say, middle-class bourgeois cultures, integrated lifestyles, is that they are not self-destroying or destroying lifestyles in which they are functional. So we don't have to be so afraid anymore of these drugs as we used to be in the 19th century. In the 19th century, when these drugs were introduced to us, and when mass alcohol use started to happen here in the United States by big immigrant groups that have had very difficult times, you could see patterns of alcohol and drug use that were quite dismal. But now we understand why this happens, the functionality of why this happens, and we now know that most drugs, all the drugs that have been mentioned, can be and are used in a highly integrated way in most of the lifestyles that we know. So the fears that we have and that we are educated with for these drugs, and that they cannot be controlled by normal human beings, those fears have no longer good evidence.
I just want to add to this discussion about ways of improving self-regulation and community regulation of drugs that are currently subject to draconian attempts to restrict their supply and restrict their demand, by bringing to your attention a dialogue that's developing in Australia that we call structural determinants. And this is really looking at factors that we can now begin to see are very important and are modifiable in terms of increasing the demand for drugs. So that by manipulating these factors a little bit, we may be able to do something about also decreasing the demand for drugs where the conventional drug education and drug supply efforts have manifestly been such a failure. Now, this is an evolving field, and I don't think it's anywhere near reached maturity, but just let me give you some idea of the flavor of this movement. It draws attention to things like trying to improve youth education opportunities, trying to reduce youth unemployment. Youth unemployment's been at very high levels in Australia for the best part of a generation. It looks at things like town planning. In many of our cities and towns across the world, we've lost those parts of our cities and towns where young people can hang out and do their thing. Those areas are pretty well closed off, and instead of closing those areas off now as part of this structural determinants movement, people are talking about maybe developing places where young people can get together and congregate and have fun and enjoy each other's company and without fear of being dispersed. It also looks at another area of early intervention in problem families, and here there is a rich literature from the United States, and I don't want to suggest that the only people who use drugs are from problem families, but they are certainly overrepresented in all countries, not just the United States. And this literature looks at really modest interventions of low cost, things like community nurses visiting a mother and her family soon after childbirth and for some intervals thereafter, and focusing on families where there's known to be a lot of problems. And what's been shown in quite extensive follow-up studies, 10, 15, 20 years and beyond, is that this simple intervention can reduce quite considerably school truancy, drug use, criminality, even divorce rates. This is quite an extraordinary area, and the cost effectiveness of these interventions have really been shown to be quite dramatically effective. So I think we have been limited in this debate in considering these sorts of alternatives because the whole focus has been on this militaristic almost operation, this war on drugs, and we really need to turn our attention to other areas where we can actually make an impact.
One of the questions that was brought up yesterday, if we just hold just a minute here, that I would like to get out on the table for sure is the Penny Rayfield mentioned that a problem in Austin was crack. And we did have Craig Reinerman was scheduled to talk about that, but as we said, his plane didn't make it. It didn't fall, it just didn't take off. And he wasn't able to be here. But I've asked Kevin Zeese if he would make a few comments about the issue of crack.
I was wondering why I was up here. Crack is a classic example, I think, of one of the costs of prohibition. You look at alcohol prohibition, for example, it changed us from a beer-using society to a whiskey and bourbon-using society. And the reason for that is because prohibition has the law of don't get caught and make the most money you can. And so smaller and more pure and more profit is what drives the market. And I think crack is a perfect example of created by prohibition. Crack, I've talked to many crack users, and it's not the drug that most crack users want. It's not a very controllable drug. Consumers would much rather have a drug they could control. And the cocaine hydrochloride taking through your nose intranasally is more controllable than crack is. And so if a consumer controlled the market, that's where it would have gone. Now, unfortunately, we do have crack, and so we have to deal with it. And unfortunately, we have to deal with it in a prohibition environment. And once again, you see prohibition making the problems worse in the way we're dealing with it. The federal law that differentiates crack and powder with 100 times more penalty for crack has resulted in really adding to the racial injustice of our criminal justice system. And you can, unfortunately, the Bush administration, through Attorney General Ashcroft, just recently came out in favor of keeping the disparity the way it is. And so they'll just continue to add to that fire. So, the question really comes down, once we move beyond the war on drugs, how do we put this genie back in the bottle? And I think that's a very tricky question, and I hope there are people smarter here than I am who can help answer that. But my sense is that if we move toward a regulated market where we emphasize public health and we emphasize investment in youth to prevent adolescent use, we will develop the kind of cultural controls that were talked about earlier. And consumers will people will choose the lesser. They will choose what they can control. And I think gradually we'll see crack diminish. It'll always be a problem. It's the genie's out of the bottle. But I think if we move toward a regulated public health-based model, we can reduce that problem. We can't reduce it in a prohibition environment. We're just going to keep putting fuel on that fire.
No, we have had crack consumption in Amsterdam going on since the early 80s. And freebase, yes, people would make their own crack, and now crack is available commercially. It is not used by the large group of cocaine users that use it for a longer evening of talking or a longer evening of dancing or a longer evening of having fun, whatever. It is used by the frequent heroin users together with their heroin. They smoke the heroin and they smoke the crack. Often they smoke it together. It's a particular subgroup of users that are attached to crack. And I don't think that we will ever lose crack. There will be a market for crack, and the strong effect it gives for a particular type of users who seek it for a particular type of effect. But I don't think that we have to be so afraid of crack. I mean, there is now a program, an experimental program for crack users in Amsterdam or Rotterdam, and there's a little bus, and they approach the crack users and they say, let's talk about the rules that you apply to crack use. And these rules of crack use are being discussed, and one of the rules that the users themselves came up with is that it would be a good idea to start a day with buying some bread and meats on it, eat some, and then when you have more money left, you spend that on crack. So the regulatory mechanisms that slowly come in place, also by these experienced users, will also slowly bring down the level of destruction and damage of crack use. People have to learn to use new drugs. LSD, when it was just new on the market, made victims because people didn't know how to first use it and how to help friends to initiate it. Later, problems with LSD initiation almost came down to zero. Ecstasy, exactly the same. People didn't know you had to chill out once in a while. People didn't know you had to drink a particular amount of water. But now that most people know, also in the initiation experiences, people are immediately told, don't do this, don't do that. The number of mistakes that people make, also the number in mistakes in dosage, the number of mistakes in combinations of drugs, will go down very quickly. So people learn to use drugs, also powerful ones. So let's not go on being afraid of this crack devil. People learn to domesticate wild horses.
Can I say a word about crack? I've been in Brazil recently, and the drug that's around in Brazil is cocaine in its various forms, powder, paste, and also crack. And I heard a report from a psychiatrist who's running a treatment program for crack users, who are self-admitted, but people who are at their wits' end with how they're feeling and how much they're using and what it's doing to them. And this fellow psychiatrist followed 50 cases who were using cannabis, using marijuana to basically detoxify from crack. And I was skeptical until he showed me, and he said some of them dropped away, but 2/3 of them stayed. And here's what they did, and they weren't heavy marijuana users before, but they began substituting the marijuana for the crack. They stopped using the crack, and then they stopped using the marijuana. And 6 months, 9 months, 12 months later, they were relatively drug-free. And I was skeptical, and then he showed me their weights, that they'd gained an average of 10 kilos. Each of them. And that's always the giveaway. That's something, if you know crack users and you know what life is like for many drug users, there's no time, or Peter mentions food. That's a very good marker for success therapeutically in drug users. The heroin maintenance program in Switzerland, one of its most impressive outcomes was weight gain among the participants, and a sign that something was different for them. So this is a medical use of marijuana. That's novel, addresses a nasty treatment problem because we don't have a lot of alternatives for treating crack once someone's in a spot. And most of the people who are heavy crack users, certainly in New York that I had experience with, were really at the bottom of society. They were the rejects of the other drug users, beat them up in Brooklyn and the Bronx and set fire to them. They were everyone's despicable model. And they certainly weren't role models for any new users of crack. So a number of good research projects that had been following drug use in Brooklyn, Sam Friedman's work and Rick Curtis's work, by, it must have been about 4 or 5 years ago, there was no crack to be found in Bedford-Stuyvesant. The dealers had been driven out. The users who were there were very, very furtive and stayed in the background, and there was no longer a marketplace in crack. It doesn't mean people weren't using drugs. They were smoking big marijuana blunts, and heroin was around. There was plenty of Colt 45, which is cheaper than Snapple. In the Bronx, there's still plenty of crack. These markets are very local. The specifics matter greatly. As soon as you get it in one place, it changes another. But if you watch it, you can extract the principles. And the principles are that when people get tired of a drug, they're quite open to alternatives. Alternative drugs or getting off drugs altogether, as long as they don't have to go back to the apartment where their brother is selling crack out of the bedroom, because then their chances of staying off are very small. So going back to the markets again, the way these markets drive the kind of patterns of use we see.
Okay, sir.
Yes, my question is for the gentleman from Canada. You didn't touch too much on it earlier, but the past couple of years, Canada's been doing tests with hemp, and last year there's the big flap on the border. They were stopping hemp products, the DEA. What problems have y'all had with that? Do y'all grow that in the mine also, or is it like in open fields, or do y'all have to put fences around it?
Frankly, I don't know what the actual growing practices are now. I believe at first we had to have licenses for it, and you probably still do need a license. But it's such as I say, it's fallen right off the radar screen in terms of an issue in Canada. I don't think it's difficult to get a license. You can grow the stuff. You can buy, hemp food products. You can buy, hemp seed oil. You can buy hemp rope. One of my students gave me some to bring down here, but I was afraid to bring it across the border.
Do you have any problems with people trying to smoke it or anything?
I think they'll have problems if they try to smoke it, because I think that we restrict the THC level to some ridiculously low amount so that they can't really get any consequential effect apart from nausea out of smoking too much of it. Yeah.
Howard, Ms. Farenthold has had to give up several times, so we don't.
Go ahead. Okay. This is for our Swiss speaker, and I missed a couple of sentences before you said that the experiences in the '80s, the experience was a necessary mistake. I remember it was about the needles, and that was the plus side. But what was the status of heroin as a regulated drug in the early '80s in Switzerland?
Well, heroin consumption began to increase dramatically at that time, and the reaction was about the same as in all the other countries. It was forbidden.
It was forbidden.
Yes, it was forbidden. It was there was no liberal policy at all. Okay. And people didn't know what to do with this phenomenon, and I think it was this AIDS epidemic where people were very scared about infectious diseases. This is a problem I always see, and I think it's in other countries the same. You can get people scared when there is an imminent threat to die, and the AIDS virus at that time was such a situation. And maybe we had the fortunate situation that we had some people at the central places who really started an AIDS campaign, which was known all over Europe and maybe even outside. And so people were really scared. And then they accepted the idea that you cannot leave the heroin consumers alone. And the problem was, how do you get needles to people who are doing something illegal? That was a big political question. Mm-hmm. And the police didn't accept that, and the public health people said, well, we have to do it. And I remember a long discussion with the Minister of Health. I had no scientific evidence at all at that time that the provision of syringes and needles had any beneficial effect. It was just biologically plausible. And I told him, do you accept that maybe after 10 years, they tell you you are responsible for the death of so many people? And that was the way that it was accepted that heroin users became visible, the way I said before. But in the 80s, before, heroin consumption was just as illegal.
It was illegal.
Yes, completely illegal. It still is.
Okay. Well, you see, we're back there in this city of Houston. We do not have a needle exchange program. And I'm trying to see what we can do, despite the mayor, to institute one here. So I'm looking for a lot of legal advice.
I think these programs are extremely necessary. We could continue these programs after this mistake of needle parks. And we have now a very fine distribution system in our canton where I'm working. We have 370,000 inhabitants. We are distributing about 300,000 needles per year and syringes, partly over outpatient places and also over old cigarette dispensers where you can put a coin in and then you get a small box with with 2 syringes and the necessary accessoires for an injection. Wow. On 39 places in this canton.
Thank you very much.
I was going to comment on Mayor Brown, and I thought his criminal response on needle exchange, people of Houston, you got to wake up and knock that guy some sense. Yeah. I mean, the evidence is so in on needle exchange saving lives that it's disgraceful for him as a former drug czar to be so uninformed. I think we need to see some health leaders in this community. You got one of the largest health centers in the world in this community. And the health leaders of this community have got to band together and start a needle exchange program, regardless of Mayor Brown. You've got to stand up and do it. That's what it takes.
I just wanted to make 3 quick points. Firstly, that there are now at least six inquiries commissioned by the US government or carried out by US government agencies that have found 2 conclusions. Firstly, that needle syringe programs are effective in reducing the spread of HIV infection. Secondly, that they do so without increasing illicit drug use. And each of those 6 inquiries, including a 7th secret inquiry that was leaked to the Washington Post, there was an internal inquiry, reached the same 2 conclusions. Second point I wanted to make is that half the needle syringe programs started in the United States were started illegally. And if no legal needle syringe program is going to start, well, maybe then you'll have to think of alternatives to legal programs to start it with. Thirdly, I just wanted to mention that that needle syringe programs in Australia, as in Switzerland, it's one of the few things Australia really does very, very well. If you would arrive in anywhere in Australia today and wanted to, for some reason, to purchase a sterile needle and syringe, you could ring up on a telephone and say you're in the Baker Institute at the corner of this street and that street, and where's the nearest needle syringe outlet, and people would tell you over the telephone. There's special telephone lines that do this. I guess everyone's here has heard of the Sydney Opera House. When you go to the toilets of the Sydney Opera House today, you'll find that there's a bin for putting your used needles and syringes in. And even when you go to the toilets of the Federal Parliament in the National Capital, you also find bins for disposing used needles and syringes. So this is all possible. It's all in the realm of possibility, and the only constraint is fear and lack of imagination to do these things.
In New York State, in the last year, we've instituted syringe availability through community pharmacies, and 2,500 pharmacies in the state of New York have signed up to make. The state legislature put a 2-year waiver, a 2-year abeyance on the paraphernalia laws in the state to allow this experiment to go forward with 2,500, and 2,500 of the state's 4,000 pharmacies stepped up to the plate. State Pharmacy Association was behind it as a public health measure, and that's going along smoothly now, in addition to needle exchange. Huh? Cost of the program or needles?
9 cents a needle.
How much? 10 cents?
9 cents.
9 cents, something like that. As opposed to $1, $2.
I'll come back and join you guys and get arrested for that one. I'm telling you, that is one you have to do here. I mean, the evidence is in. It's disgraceful, one of the largest cities in the country with such a serious problem, not to step up and do something with all these medical officials in this community.
Can I comment on that, Bill? I think Kevin knows this, and he's probably just challenging me to stand up and say it. But many years ago, we arranged the first meeting in the city of Houston ever between the chief of police and the head of the health and
the health director, yeah.
Whatever. Never before in the history of Houston had those 2 people ever met. And we had a meeting with the mayor's drug czar, who was over here in the corner when the mayor was speaking. And we had a meeting, and they all agreed completely with us. Surgeon General, Clinton Surgeon General, had agreed that this made sense, and we found that Chief Bradford and Mary Kendrick, the health head, both agreed, and Houston should have a needle exchange program. Furthermore, the Open Society Institute had promised us $25,000 to match the equal funds from the city of Houston if the city of Houston would do it. And Chief Bradford said he'd be happy to cooperate and would look the other way if only he could. But we had a very tough district attorney back then named Johnny Holmes, who I remember speaking for law enforcement at an earlier Baker Institute conference. And he said under no circumstances he wouldn't even agree to meet with us. And it was so outrageous that the chief of police decided he could not possibly take the risk of looking the other way to give clean needles to save it. And not only that, but we had Dr. Drucker's report showing how much money could be saved, not to mention lives and misery. And so we were put with several different conditions that we had to do. We had to get a majority of the city council on our side. We took a stab at that. We had to get the Houston Chronicle behind us, and we thought that was feasible. We had arranged to at least talk about it. We had to get 2 senators, conservative senators in the state legislature concerned about it. That was tougher. And the plain fact of it is that none of us, we don't have any support. We don't have any staff to work with. And we're still don't have any funds to work with. We're a totally voluntary outfit. And there is just nobody in the city of Houston, and I think you had it confirmed as beautifully as you could possibly have had it confirmed. Nobody gives a damn about it. But Kevin, if you will come down here and take the risk of being arrested, I'll stand up there with you.
That's the spirit. That's 2. Do I have 3? All right, there's a 4th. All right.
Howard Wilders from Fort Worth. First, I'd like to thank all the members of the panel from coming from so far away. Truly, you and your nations are lighthouses which are shining a powerful light on this problem. As Dr. van der Linden said, Switzerland, for example, has made necessary mistakes. I'm sure your countries have also made some mistakes, but at least you're moving forward, making mistakes, and then making progress. And I thank you for that as an American. We need all your lighthouse effects to help us with our particular situation in America. I have a real good sense here of what's happening in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, in England. My question is for Dr. Wodak and Mr. Ascapella. What do you see, where do you see Australia and Canada, say 5-10 years down the road in terms of harm reduction or any other laws or procedures that will be changed?
Well, in terms of harm reduction, Canada has not done as well as Australia in preventing HIV infection and hepatitis C infection amongst drug users. So there's a lot more we can do, even within the current legal structure. It's very difficult to know where we're going to go. I mean, I would have hoped that 10 years ago, with the logic and the futility of prohibition, that we would have thought that through. But the trouble is, politicians everywhere have a 4 or 5 year mandate, and that's the sort of horizon that they look at when they're dealing with issues. And it takes you 2 years to get them educated about the issue when they first get elected, and then in the last half of their mandate, they're afraid to do anything because they want to get reelected. So we're in this constant cycle of re-education, getting people on side, and then having them say, well, it's too late to do anything. I think we are looking at Europe, and I should say we're also looking at Australia, because we have much to learn from these places. I think we will look away from the American model more and more, and then the big issue is what pressure the United States will apply on us, and how much we can educate our own people. I don't want to blame the United States for Canadian intransigence on some of these things. We've been stubborn and blind to these issues very much ourselves. I mean, our failures in drug policies are not because of the United States primarily. So I wish I could predict. I think we're moving forward. There's more open public discourse in Canada. Politicians are talking quite openly about drug policy issues. Many of the senators, I've appeared before Senate and House of Commons committees, they're talking on the record about the futility of what we're doing. So that's a very good sign. And just the fact that we can hold conferences quite easily in Canada to discuss these issues, and we don't have to worry about sort of the political ramifications of it as much. And as I say, the Department of Justice funding the study I'm doing. I think those are hopeful signs. And you talk on open line radio programs, very what we would consider right wing, very sort of morally conservative groups, and people aren't criticizing the initiatives anymore. They're on side.
Thank you for the question. I don't want to give the audience the misleading impression that everything is a sea of enlightenment in Australia and that we're going from success to success. There are a lot of struggles, a lot of outcomes that everyone finds appalling. I've told you one of the triumphs, which is the control of HIV infection among and from injecting drug users, but we've had a rapid increase in drug overdose deaths from a total of 6 in the year 1964 to a total of 958 in 1999 in a country with a population of 19 million. It's since fallen to 725 in the year 2000. But there's been a dramatic increase over many years. we also have a significant problem with hepatitis C, and we've estimated that the number of new infections in hepatitis C increased from 11,000 in 1997 to 16,000 in 2001, largely because although the number of infections per 100 drug users is falling, the population of drug users is still increasing so rapidly. So we still have very significant problems. In the last 6 years, we've had a Prime Minister who's been extremely antagonistic to harm reduction and is a great fan of zero tolerance, which he's a phrase which was new to Australia until he uttered it. And he has really held up a lot of things that many of us have wanted very badly, and which are now very widely supported by influential leaders. And significantly, one of these things is a prescription heroin trial, which was agreed to by a 2/3 majority of national police and health ministers meeting in July 1997. So 6 of the 9 states and the federal body as well, 6 of the 9 voted for this heroin trial, and the Prime Minister stopped it. So I think one of the things that's going to happen in the next 5 years or so will be a heroin trial, but many of the other things that are going on, despite a very antagonistic Prime Minister, will accelerate once he's gone. And one of these things is a movement in emphasis from the criminal justice system to the law enforcement system. Even under the current Prime Minister, we have a major diversion scheme which is doing basically what Proposition 36 is doing in California, but doing that not through the proposition process, not through the Citizens Ballot Initiative process, but through a collection of the national government working with the state governments. So this is a major thing that's happening. Most of the states are now in the process of slowly, incrementally liberalising their cannabis laws, so they're slowly reducing the penalties and fiddling around with the threshold levels so that the rather oppressive nature of the cannabis legislation is decreasing somewhat. And I think this trend will continue, and we will, I guess, move in 5 to 10 years to taxing and regulating cannabis, because that clearly is where we have to end up. Cannabis should be taxed like other commodities, shouldn't be untaxed like it is at present. Cannabis represents 1% of Australia's economy, and presently that's untaxed and controlled by criminals and corrupt police. Well, who wants to see that continue? So I think these changes will go on. What I'd like to see amongst our goals in the next 5 to 10 years is that we dramatically reduce drug overdose deaths in Australia, as has been achieved in Switzerland and as has been achieved all along in the Netherlands. Switzerland halved their drug overdose deaths in the last 6 years, and the Netherlands has overdose deaths of about 40 to 50 per year in a country of population of 15 million. I'd like to see Australia getting down to that. I'd also like to see us controlling hepatitis C, and I'd also like to see us controlling drug-related crime and decreasing corruption amongst police and other officials. And I think we're going to see movement in that direction because of a general shift from a law enforcement emphasis towards a health and social initiatives type approach.
I'm sorry, we are coming to the end of this period. Did Peter had said you wanted to say, did you have a thing you wanted to say that you haven't already said? Okay, all right, fine. Well, you've been staying there, Dean and David. If you
could be quick.
Very quickly.
Okay. First off, I wanted to say that it's people like the police force in Los Angeles that helped guard the medical marijuana out there that are, in my eyes, patriots. It's people like Terrence Hallinan, the DA, who held a bullhorn and talked to Asa Hutchinson, basically asking him to leave California. And it was Mayor LaGuardia who was very instrumental in ending the first prohibition on alcohol. I want to thank everybody here. You give me hope. Houston needed to hear this, and I appreciate it. And my main question is, what can we do to encourage other people, the average citizen, to help end this madness called the war on drugs? Thank you.
Well, I think this is something that we're going to be addressing. Ambassador Jerigian has talked with most of these folk, as I have in the last few days. We're taking this quite seriously and want to see. We do not want this to die with just having had a good collection of people here giving very interesting presentations. David?
My name is David Nobles. I'm from here in Houston. This morning, Michael Trace mentioned that in Europe, there are 6 objectives in the national strategies that are kind of generally negotiated into them. One of them he mentioned was the issue of social exclusion. I take that to mean that once someone is scapegoated, that they are brought back into society, and that doesn't happen here. I'd like to know what types of actions the European countries are doing to prevent social exclusion. Thank you.
Yeah, social exclusion because of when people deal in their houses, they can be evicted from their house. So when they stop dealing or when they want to change their lives, there often are no possibilities for them to find a house. So all over the Netherlands you have institutions that will help people that are marginalized or that are homeless to organize their lives in such a way that they can go back to renting a house. There is all kinds of organizations that will help people that are down and out, that are marginalized, to come back into the health care system. There are people that need social work. For instance, they have lost contact with their kids and they would like to take up contact with their kids and reconstruct some parts of their lives, and you can get that type of help. That is what is meant by neutralizing the effects of marginalization. Sometimes when you are marginalized to a particular degree, you do not have the tools to reintegrate. You need to be helped to reintegrate into particular aspects of society, and if you do not take care that those institutions that can do that help are in place, marginalization will remain a dangerous side effect of illicit drug use or such high levels of alcohol use that you can no longer be part of society. So reintegration is the opposite of marginalization, and you need institutionalized help for that.
Let me say one last word about heroin-assisted treatment. 30% of our people in these programs, of course only 4% of the whole, they are working in a full-time job, and many people don't even know that they are on such a program. The selection of these persons is from the worst experience with heroin, and they, through these programs, can be socially reintegrated. About 30%. Well, it depends from city to city, but about 30%.
Well, thank all of you panel members again, and we'll clear off here quickly and listen to Ethan Nadelman's valedictory.